Please be seated. Going to start with a pop rhetorical quiz. I won't put you on the spot. You don't have to sing out answers. Going back to Robin's sermon last week, and wasn't it a good one? Yeah, really good unpacking of Amos. What was it that the nation of Israel did that made God cast them out? What was it that ended up having them out of their land for good? I'm going to let you sit on that for a bit. And I'm going to tell you a story. So I had quite an unusual encounter on Friday night. I was waiting for a friend of mine at our favourite bar, one we have known for some time, and he was late. Typical. The place was full, not just because he's a bloke. And I must admit, it was one of those, it was a really cool friend of mine, and I'm walking through, and there were a lot of men that looked just like him because they were all really cool. So, yeah, doing the scout around. But I did find a table, and I sat down, so it was packed. And then a stranger pulled up a seat at my table. Yeah. On finding out that I was an Anglican priest, he gave me an opinion, though, although not much of a church goer, he wouldn't be an Anglican. Our God is too nice. We're a bit woke. He wanted some proper fire and brimstone. And so I said to him, well, you know, I'm preaching on Amos this Sunday, make sure you come to church. He really believes that the only thing that will convince people to follow Jesus and be with God is a bit of fear of what's coming next. Well, I said to him, that was the preaching we grew up with, wasn't it? Ever got scared by a sermon when you were a kid? I certainly did. But it isn't really making the same impact anymore. Because people just don't believe it's going to happen. And as I thought about it later, I wondered if it's more that people out there just don't think they can do what it takes to be forgiven or to be loved. And I wonder if that's more what it is. Either way, the threat of judgment has never really worked to make vibrant communities. Surely, said the man, God has to come down and reign with fire, right? Because the world is a mess. What else is going to happen? Your Anglican God is just too nice. As I said, I'm preaching on Amos today. I promised, expect a bit of judgment there. The world really is a mess. He's not wrong. That's where our free will got us. If we learn anything from Amos today, it could well be that God is calling us to name the patently obvious. The world is a mess, even when that message will be rejected. Last week, in Robin's sermon from the previous text, we heard that Amos had no desire to be a prophet. He wasn't a professional religious person. He had a proper job. He was a shepherd. He looked after the sycamore trees. He had a purpose and a place in society. And the society was wealthy. It was going well. Everything was very comfortable for a lot of people. But God called him to speak instead a prophetic word. And remember that prophecy is about telling the truth rather than predicting the future. Let's see what he had to say. He says, "The end has come upon my people Israel. I will never again pass them by." So Israel is north of Judah, in the land that became Samaria. So you should start building links there. "The songs of the temple shall become wailings on that day, says the Lord God. The dead bodies shall be many, cast out in every place. Be silent." The sobering aspect of Amos's prophecy is that there is no call for repentance. There's no call to come back. There's no reaching out from God, no last chances, just the promise of destruction. It's too late. The evil has gone too far, and there is no hope for Israel. A bowl of ripe fruit that looks promising, but will soon rot or be devoured. What is it that could bring God to this point? What could they have done? On the surface, everything looked okay. What is it that they have done that even God can see no other hope for this nation but to tear it down and start again? Hear this, you that trample on the needy and bring ruin to the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, so we may offer wheat for sale? Hear this, says Amos. And this section stands out because everywhere else, Amos is saying, the Lord said, the Lord showed me. Amos isn't attributing these words to God. This is Amos's assessment of what had happened in Israel. There's no mention of a vision or a word from God. Amos can see himself full well what's happening. The people had disrespected their relationship with God. They had disrespected their promises with God. They begrudge taking time off to rest for a Sabbath because it takes time away from making money. They begrudge the sacrifices they offer at a full moon towards God in acknowledgement of what God does for them because it takes away from making money. They want to go on their own way, and they want to sell the poor, literally people. They want to abuse the needy. So Amos doesn't call the people back to God. So egregious and obvious is the inequity and injustice that Amos takes God's side and agrees with the judgment he's heard. We will make the ephah small and the shekel great, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Their lives are cheap, and selling the sweepings of the wheat, even the useless chaff, is a profit. The Lord has sworn by the pride of Jacob, surely I will never forget any of their deeds. So last week, Robin told us about how wealthy the nation of Israel was, with good food available and good housing and comforts. But this wealth had come by the exploitation and enslavement of those labouring on the land. Amos was a shepherd and a tender of figs, and he could see it a mile off. Amos goes on to inhabit the character of the wealthy people he sees around him, boasting that the measures are small and the cost of goods is great, and the farmers, the poor of the land, are cheated with tempered scales. Look, the merchants say, we can buy people for nothing, the needy for nothing, and we can even sell the rubbish as wheat. And the Lord knows you won't change, says Amos. Because rather than declare the judgment by God doesn't use God's own name here. God swears this in the name of the pride of Jacob. Their very own pride is as consistent and as unchangeable as God. So, back to the scratch bar on Park Road for a minute. Can you imagine what the man at the bar would be thinking at this point? What's he expecting me to say next? Here comes the fire and brimstone, finally, those Anglicans have got it right. And while there is, Amos does promise that the land will tremble and be tossed about, and an earthquake did come. That's not the worst of their future. The people are about to mourn and lament, but to no avail. The time is surely coming, says the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of water, of bread, or a thirst for water, not those things, but of hearing the word of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, from north to east. They shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. Those that were claiming to be God, that worshipped in beautiful ways, in beautiful temples, had become irreversibly corrupted. They would hear from their Lord no more, and they will know the loss. And they will search for what they've lost, but never again find God. How can that be the worst thing? To cap the section off, and we didn't read this in our text, the Lord tells Amos to promise this. In that day, the beautiful young women and the young men shall faint for thirst. Those who swear by Asherah of Samaria and say, as your God lives, O Dan, and as the way of Beersheba lives, they shall fall and never rise again. No more does the Lord speak. No famine of bread, nor drought, but a thirst for God. You see, the religious practice in the surrounds of Israel was the worship of idols. And their practice, the reason they worshipped, was to appease angry gods. And people fell into line, particularly when the state insisted they worshipped idols. The deity of Samaria, the golden calf of Dan, and the religion of Beersheba. Amos is telling us the practice of worshipping idols is hopeless. That's not where God resides. Israel had the promise of God. They would be God's own people. They would be a nation that lived up to the promises and extravagant grace of God, led by the Davidic line, keeping the 10 Commandments, remembering the Sabbath, honouring God, loving their neighbour. But they put their individual wealth before God. They put their individual wealth before their neighbour. They were impatient with God's Sabbath. They could not even give God time and rest. They begrudged the offerings. They cheated one another. And in doing so, they cheated God. They broke their promise with God, a promise that was kept by God, made with God's integrity, in God's love. The fear they should have felt was the fear of breaching this holy promise, of breaking their relationship with God. But they acted instead out of greed and selfishness, out of a fear of missing out of something for themselves. And the loss of that relationship was to be so much worse than the devastation that came to the nation. To act out of fear of brimstone and fire is to behave like people who worship idols, is to try and appease an angry God, to shore up your own circumstances or our own circumstances by pleasing a deity that's going to cause us trouble. But the covenantal relationship that Israel had enjoyed with God was something completely different, something they lost. And as a people, as a nation, they fell apart. To dissolve and fracture may be less fear-inducing than fire and brimstone, but it's no less devastating. It's perhaps even more tragic. So what's our take home today? Robin brought this up in her last sermon, and it's really interesting. I had a couple of people say to me, did we get two opposite sermons the last 2 weeks? No, you didn't. So I thought I'd better unpack this a little bit further for us today. So what this data is a release of church growth and decline in the UK. And much has been said about this in the media, mainstream, as well as Christian media. And so what you can see here, this chart is the red are the evangelicals. So clearly they're on fire, and then they get like a little more lukewarm later as we get to the liberals. No, that's... I do think that might be what people were thinking. Okay, so red is evangelical in this. Then you get to the Baptist and the Church of England, which are kind of half and half, and then moving down, the Baptist in the UK, different from our Baptists here. So it's a pretty clear story, people are saying. The more liberal you are, the more likely your church is to decline. Yep. And that's the take-home people took yesterday. Let's look at the data a bit closer. You know I'm a nerd. And you all are too, actually. I love this community because I can get into this stuff. This is the other side of the story. The blue are denominations that are from before 1900. The red are new denominations, post-1900. And the biggest growers, brand new denominations. And when I say brand new, I mean 1970 plus. We're Anglican, right? So they knew as far as we're concerned. Something is happening in these new denominations and people are growing. What is it? So let's have a little zoom in a little bit there. These are the churches they're talking about. Now they've been labelled evangelical in the church literature. But anyone who knows their churchmanship knows that's actually not 100% accurate. Vineyard, New Frontiers and Elim are all Pentecostal or charismatic. Okay? And that's new. We're talking 1970s, that movement started, aren't we? You were around, I was born. Yep. So, this is more complex than we might be thinking, isn't it? You know, I can preach a good expository sermon, but is that going to be what people around us need? There is, I'm a qualitative researcher as well as a quantitative researcher, so I have a lot bias this way. There was a beautiful research study done in the States by the Fuller Institute. 10,000 hours of interviews, 1,300 people individually interviewed across 40 states. They travelled everywhere. And they found the churches that could be vital. They found churches that were growing. They found churches where young people stayed. They found churches where young people were participating and engaged and active, and older people were working alongside them. Does that sound like the sort of church we want to be? What is it? Notice the first one on the list, American Anglican. Then we look at the Episcopals make a mention in there too, right? So both ends of our Anglicanism in the States have examples of churches that are doing well. All sorts of churches. The Orthodox is in there, the Roman Catholics are in there. Some of them have less than 100 people. Some of them have more than 10,000 people. They have different sorts of demographics, different sorts of races. Some are predominantly white, some are mixed, some are predominantly Hispanic or predominantly Black American or predominantly Asian. All the regions in the US were represented. Suburban, urban, rural and mixed. The age of the church, not the children. So some of them were brand new churches, less than 5 years old, growing. Some were over 140 years old. God works in all sorts of places. So what is it? What is it that is the sign that God will work? This is what they came up with, but do you see the centre? Jesus. A Jesus-centred community. So what does that look like? A Jesus-centred community. And if we are talking about, because we do have, you know, we're missing some generations, let's be clear, right? But with some of them are at night time too. It's not like they're not here. But the Anglican Church in general is missing some generations. If we want to engage with everyone, the first thing we need to do is have empathy with what is happening in the world today. Okay? Our young people are in a different world. they are facing a future unlike anything we face. They're in the middle of a digital revolution. They don't know what occupations are going to exist. They may not be able to buy houses. They may not even have housing. This is the world they're in. Okay? And so we need to have empathy for that. They need to hear Jesus' message. And you can imagine what Amos might be saying today. And do you know what? Our young people aren't necessarily looking for a whole bunch of young people to hang out with. They can get that at the Valley on Friday night. But they are looking for warm relationships. They are looking for connection. They are looking to be validated. I bring my boys here, 2 12-year-olds. They are known by name. They are loved. They know you and they know you love them. The churches that are growing are the best neighbours. They know what's happening in their particular context. There's no program that makes for great churches. They look at the world they're in and they're the hands and feet of Jesus there. With regards to leadership, the most vibrant churches are not the one with the person at the front who holds all the power. The person at the front throws the keychain. Right? Here you go, here are the keys. I'll give you the support, I'll teach you the skills, I'll let you lead. The more people we have leading, the more people we have growing. And the churches that are growing and vibrant and are full of life prioritise the young people and the youth everywhere. It's not to say that we don't look after the needs of our older generations, because let's face it, if we've got our young people along with us, we all kind of feel a bit better, don't we? How lovely is it when we've got a child running around? All of a sudden everything lifts and we become more alive. And we are using our giftedness and supporting the next generations. We're reaching back and pulling them along with us. So we prioritise young people. We think, yeah, is this something that young people could access? And when I'm saying young people, we now talk 15 to 30 are young. Okay? This is our call. If we... and I'm talking about the whole church, not just Anglican even, just all of us. If Christianity rests on our laurels and we engage with our religious practice as superficially as those who abused the poor and neglected the Sabbath and begrudged giving to God in Amos's time, why would God continue with us? Why not start over? If we are lukewarm, if we are reluctant in talking about our faith, why would anyone want to come? But there is always hope. Israel was razed to the ground, essentially. But do you remember last week the story of the Good Samaritan? From Samaria, the land of Israel. And Jesus deliberately told that story. Here's our hope. My person is the one who has mercy, who shows my love. Even out of the ashes, God can raise up new people. If we honour the promise we have in Jesus, if we appreciate and love the promise we have of being God's own family, following the way of his life through Jesus' death and resurrection, if our lives reach out to our neighbours with Christ's own hands, with God's own care, if we speak God's truth to the poor and the needy, and we speak God's truth to those that oppress the poor and the needy, who wouldn't want to come here? Imagine who we could be, individuals and together, in the name of Christ.